My name is Hans LADEGAARD and I'm a professor in the Department of English and Communication, which is part of the Humanities faculty at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. I'm here to talk about my new book, Migrant Workers, Narratives of Return, Alienation and Identity Transformations, which was published recently by Routledge. Many domestic migrant workers spend the better part of their lives working overseas, separated from their children, husbands and other close family members and friends. This is not something they do by choice, but they do it because they cannot support their family financially, their children's education, for example, unless at least one parent works overseas. This book set out to explore what happens when they eventually go home after 15 or 20 years or more in Hong Kong or another overseas destination. What happens when they come back to children they have spent very little time with? Will they welcome them back or will they resent them for leaving? And what about their husbands? We know from domestic migrant workers' testimonials that it's common for husbands who are left behind to take a mistress. Will the marriage survive this when the wife eventually returns? And what about the migrant women themselves? Will they fit in their home communities after being away for so many years? I went to Indonesia and the Philippines in 2014 and 15 to try to get answers to these questions. Working closely with local migrant worker NGOs, I visited a total of 30 villages in East and Central Java in Indonesia and in Bohol in the south of the Philippines. I conducted sharing sessions or group interviews with 117 domestic migrant workers who had come back to the home country within the past year. So, what did we find? My sample is not big enough to make any generalizations about differences between Indonesian and Filipino domestic migrant workers, but it is noticeable that in my sample of stories, and that is 117 in total, there are marked differences between Indonesian and Filipino migrant workers' experience. The Filipino returnees tell mostly positive stories. I work with the concept of narrative identity, and the identity positions Filipino women claim for themselves are generally very positive. They refer to themselves as household managers. They were in charge of large households. They cooked and looked after children. They made important contributions to their families and to Hong Kong society, and they are proud of what they've done, and given the opportunity to go overseas again, most of them would. The Indonesian returnees, on the other hand, tell mostly negative stories. Stories of abuse and exploitation, stories of excessive work days of 16 hours or more are typical, and stories of underpayment and not enough food and proper rest. The identity positions they claim for themselves are that they were victims of human-inflicted suffering and they were unable to put down their foot. Many of them stayed with abusive employers for too long and therefore they eventually came back to their families deeply traumatized. I argue that the relative success of the Filipino women's stories is related to several factors. First, they are older and more mature than their Indonesian peers. Second, they speak good English. Third, they're well educated. Fourth, they know about their rights. And finally, they decide for themselves that they want to go to Hong Kong. The Indonesian women, on the other hand, 1. tend to be very young. Some were as young as 16 or 17 when they came to Hong Kong with a fake age in their passport. 2. They speak no English and very little Cantonese. 3. They have no education. 4. Know nothing about their rights. And 5. They were often signed up by their fathers or husbands, sometimes even without their consent. But common for both groups was the realization that migration involves huge sacrifices. Many returnees experienced a sense of alienation. They were not immediately accepted back into their homes and neighborhoods, and the most painful experience for many was the fact that their children did not recognize them as their mother because a sister or grandmother had taken that role for many years. I finished the book by discussing how we as academics can use our research to benefit the communities we research, in my case, domestic migrant worker communities. I propose that we take our findings back to the communities who helped us generate the data, use what we know about domestic migrant workers' lives and experiences to empower migrant women, and, in collaboration with migrant worker NGOs, do what we can to push for more awareness of migrant workers' rights, and ultimately to push for better working conditions for domestic migrant workers.